guess good afternoon. Is my microphone on? Yes, that sounds better now. Okay. So I'm keenly aware that I'm standing between all of you and lunch, so I'm just going to kick off rather than talk about myself. So about 2 or 3 years ago, IBM conducted a study of, they spoke to about 1,500 CEOs and heads of large organizations around the world. It's about 60 countries altogether. And they held a lot of in-depth interviews. And what they were trying to understand was what it was like to run a large organization in today's current environment. And one of the conclusions they came to was this was actually the first sentence, I think, of the report, was that events and threats, but also opportunities, obviously, aren't not just coming at us faster or with less predictability. They're converging, they're influencing each other, and they're creating these new situations that are infinitely more challenging, but also interesting than potentially in the past. And so they require this unprecedented amount of creativity to sort out and deal with what to do next, to understand what is the path you should take. Now, around the same time, this gentleman, John Seely Brown, who tends to work on a lot of projects related to organizational change, and he's also one of the principals at the Deloitte Center for the Edge, and he was working with John Nagel and Lang Davidson, and they were also conducting a piece of research. And what they were trying to do was kind of quantify or visually, mentally map long-term technological change to try to chart a path forward of where might we be going. And so they started looking in the past. They went back to the 18th century, and what they were looking at was the creation of what they called infrastructural technologies, things like electricity, the internal combustion engine, things that really changed society. And they mapped it through 18th, 19th, 20th century. And what they found was really quite consistent. You'd have the inception point of a technology, and then you'd have a period of really rapid change, innovation, new products, all these things kind of converging, and then it would stable out, right? And then you'd have a period of maybe 50, 60 years of stability. And from a company perspective, this was often the point where people would start to develop scalable efficiency, organizational processes, things that would kind of lead them on until that next period where something would happen. And so that was 18th, 19th, 20th century, always this process, basically. And then they looked at the 21st century, and it looked like this. And so what you have are, first of all, far more things kicking off, far more technologies that are actually disruptive enough. And they kick off, you get the period of rapid change, but then before they even really get to any point of stability, some new thing happens, and they start to overlap. And it really dramatically mirrors what the IBM study found, was that there's all this overlapping stuff. You're not really sure if a period of stability is actually going to happen, when it's going to happen, for how long, but at the same time, there's all this opportunity. And that's kind of the environment that we're in at the moment. So what I'm going to discuss are, as we said in the introduction, is 3 mindsets for thinking not just about design, but creativity and certainly innovation within this period that we currently live in. And there is definitely a lot of uncertainty, but there's also quite a great deal of opportunity. So the first mindset is entitled Desire Paths. And I know it's a bit of a airy-fairy kind of word, but there's actually a reason why that's what it's called, and we'll get to that in just a minute. And I will kick us off with a quote by marketer extraordinaire Seth Godin. He always comes up with the best sound bites. This is really very true, and this has been happening for at least a good 10 years now, thanks to the internet and mobile, and certainly things like social are starting to propel this, is that the idea that someone, often typically companies, can program our consumption, it's becoming irrelevant. It's completely becoming obsolete, and it's moving quite quickly. And definitely, the balance of power has started to shift and is probably shifting quite considerably in the path of the consumer. The idea that we can, develop a product and that we'll have this beautiful, linear, kind of highly controlled, exclusive, predictable path where we'll know what the consumer will be doing. There'll be this journey. The journey will always be the same. It's no longer really what's happening. At the very least, what consumers often do these days is they just chart their own path. They create their own experiences, either above or below or beyond the ones that we're creating anyways. And this manifests in all sorts of ways. I mean, one of the first things that's happening increasingly is that if they don't like something, or they feel experimental, or any number of reasons. They just change things that we build. So as an example, this is the Amazon Dash button, which came out a few months ago. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a little physical button. There's a whole bunch of them. You can order them from Amazon. I think they charge you $5 for the button, because they'll charge for everything at this point. So you order the button, and you stick it in your house. And the button, each one of these does one thing, which is basically it resupplies your house with that thing. And it's aimed at fast-moving consumer goods, things like laundry powder and razor blades, because razor blades are one of those things. And so you press the button, and Amazon goes and dispatches this thing to you. So it's an interesting experiment in and of itself. But what happened is, as soon as these things were released, people started doing other things with them. Anyone who knew how to program in any way, shape, or form started hacking them to track or do all sorts of things. They would press the button, and it would go to an Excel spreadsheet, and then it would go to a GitHub repo, and it would do things. And it was just, you can find all of these experiments on the internet, and you can find videos. And this is not anything Amazon ever intended. The other thing that customers very frequently do is they now start to kind of cobble experiences by combining products in ways that probably mystify the people who created them in terms of why someone might have put these things together. And then finally, inevitably in all of this, you end up with these scenarios where this starts to create kind of, uncomfortable areas of competition, or kind of, starting to behave uncomfortably with the product. This, for example, is an app store in Thailand. This is a few years old now, but these still exist, actually, all over the world, because they meet a specific need. Basically, what it is it's not piracy, just to be clear. I mean, I'm sure Apple considers it piracy, and certain app developers probably do as well. But the intent is actually to purchase an app. The problem is that most people on the planet don't have a credit card. And so you have an environment that's almost entirely based on owning a credit card as the entry point. And so people find workarounds. And this is an example, again, you'll find it around the world, of workarounds to the App Store model, simply just because of that. And so, all of these examples are kind of indicative, because they start to show really that, again, this balance of power is shifting, and it's just going to keep progressing with things like 3D printing and all these new technologies. It really starts to create this tension between the things that we create and we kind of give out to people, and the experiences that they actually want, and that they will progressively probably take more and more control over. Now, of course, this causes stress. Obviously, this causes stress if you build any sort of product, but it isn't necessarily a bad thing. And this is a quote from a lovely book called Loose. A gentleman by the name of Martin Thomas published it a few years ago, and the whole point of the book was to challenge our assumptions about how we build products. And what he found was that issuing your customers with something that's rough or incomplete, or even possibly substandard, everyone gets to decide what substandard means, it sounds counterintuitive, but there's growing evidence that customers don't always want this perfect thing, right? What they actually often want is something maybe a bit more ragged around the edges, where they can adapt and improve it. And again, the idea that the customer in some ways really knows themselves how they want to improve it, and that you might never really actually know. So now, again, depending on how you feel about this, clearly there are definitely companies that have taken this ethos on as their entire way that they build products, right? I mean, IKEA is a really good example. They've got this real pragmatism about something that's definitely beautiful, but it is also good enough. No one goes to IKEA to get perfection, and in some ways, I don't think the design brief for most IKEA products is probably not perfection. It's that kind of good enough adaptability that works for the customer, and that fits a really good niche. And you see that all over the world, people flock to IKEA for that reason. Another brand where, again, this was quite deep in how they founded the company, which is Muji, the Japanese retailer, that a little similar to IKEA. They do fashion and some home products and knickknacks and things. And they very specifically says, this is Kenya Hara, their head of design, that he wants to give customers the kind of satisfaction that comes from simply saying, this will do, right? They don't want to create that appetite of, I want this. They just want the acceptance of, yeah, this is good, I want this, but simply because it's good enough at this point for me, and that's fine. So whether as a company, whether you embrace this mindset or not, the reality is that people will always find their own uses for things. And this is the thing, again, that I'm going to talk about a little bit further. And as an example, I'll start with an example with a bunch of sheep that are for sale on Instagram. And this is something, not specifically the sheep, but the selling things on Instagram that took off in Kuwait a couple years ago. But again, you will find this around the world. You'll find it on all sorts of social platforms. And the idea basically is that you have this platform where you've got lots of distribution. You've got people, you can chat with them, you can do stuff. So people take a picture, they'll put a price tag on it somehow, and then they'll stick it on the platform and they'll try to find a customer. And in Kuwait, Instagram is very popular for little ad hoc kind of let's build a product out of nothing and stick it on Instagram to sell it. In Thailand, where the penetration for Facebook was extremely high, for a while it was about 80% of the internet population in Thailand was using Facebook. So Facebook was kind of the natural spot for people to start doing this. To be clear, neither Facebook or Instagram or any of these social brands actually enabled this in any way, except that what they created was this malleable, global, easy-to-use, works on every single device, always-on platform that you could do enough with that you could kind of twist it to your own purposes. There was no shopping cart, there was no payment program, there was nothing, right? It was just people using it kind of in an ad hoc way. And to get an idea of how this works, so here's an example. This is from Thailand with Instagram this time. So social vendors, they usually kind of, they'll name themselves in a way that it's easy to find that they're a social vendor. They'll provide contact information and so on right off the bat. And then as a user, you go through their content, which is usually the stuff that's for sale. And on platforms like Instagram make this very easy because it's all about photos, but it's been done on many other platforms. And then they'll start a dialogue with the vendor. And depending on the platform, that dialogue could happen on that platform, or it might happen somewhere else. In this case, because Instagram isn't really a good chat medium, the conversation took place online, which is another really popular chat app in Thailand at the moment. But if it were in another country, if it were Brazil, it would probably be WhatsApp, and in China it would be WeChat, and there's all these other alternatives around the world. And so the point of the dialogue is to negotiate, is to inquire, try to establish trust, make sure the person is really a person. And usually if you're shopping already on these platforms, you've probably heard it from a friend anyways. That's how a lot of these things get around. You might exchange extra photos to, you might want to see the back of the product or the side of the product. They might send you another photo. At some point you agree a price, and then you start to talk about payment. And here again, it entirely depends on the context. Again, in China, if it were WeChat, there's a payment platform built right in, which probably they might use. They might use Alipay. If you are in North America, it would probably be something like PayPal. In this case, in Thailand, a lot of people still pay by bank. They actually go and you can scan a QR code and pay at an ATM, basically, or at your bank, and then the payment passes through. So every process really ends up being different. And then once you have a payment confirmation, whatever that may be, then you dispatch the goods. And quite often, there'll be like a courier shipping manifest number provided, right? So it's this mixture of completely modern and then completely ad hoc, kind of all jumbled together. Kind of what it needs to be, completely hacking the product. Hacking a great number of products in some ways to come to a mutually acceptable interaction. So this practice of kind of doing these things, but also looking for them, right? From a product perspective, city planners and architects, they tend to call these desire paths. And in the case of architecture, it is often very well an actual path, right? They'll go to a park when it's snowed, and they'll look where people are walking, because that gives them clues to things that they might have missed, to suboptimal aspects of their design, but also just opportunities, things that they haven't thought about how people decide to ambulate through a space, how people are living with the space, and the space for them is the product, right? So that's the analogy. Now, as a company, though, if you choose to leverage these desire paths, you can do quite a bit. So here's one example of a company that took one of these insights and did something with it quite substantial. So a lot of these examples are from emerging economies, because this is where you find a lot of this going on right now for a whole bunch of reasons. So this is YY. It is a platform that conceptually it's a bit like Google Hangout. You've got live video, audio, and you can have conversations. And there's also a kind of a chat element to it. So it's got hundreds of millions of users, millions of channels, and people do karaoke and talk radio, and celebrities come and chat with an audience, and there's educational topics and all that. Now, YY actually started as a gaming site. The whole point of the video and the audio was that gamers would want to talk strategy as they were gaming, and that's why they did that. They had the audio and video for that purpose, except the site was growing really fast. They had a really, really big audience, but they had no profit. And they discovered, after a period of time, that a portion of their audience was increasingly doing something completely other than gaming. What they were actually doing was singing. There was karaoke groups developing on the side, on the platform. And so right there, they had a choice. They could have said, oh, hold on, this is not how the platform works. We'll stop it, we'll ban it, we'll close them down, whatever. But they said, OK, hold on, let's start to experiment. Let's see what we can do with it. And so what they decided was that they wanted to help people kind of start to engage during karaoke, as people do in real life. So they created virtual tickets that they would hand out, and the point was that you could use these little tickets or tokens to vote for your favorite singer. And lo and behold, they realized very quickly that people were taking these tickets, putting them on Taobao, which is one of the large marketplace sites run by Alibaba in China, where you can it's like eBay basically. As a consumer, you can just put things on there and sell them. And they had created this kind of underground consumer economy for these little tickets. And so again, here they had a choice to make. They could have gone to Alibaba and said, this is illegal use of our IP or something like that. But no, they decided, OK, fine, let's try it. And now the site basically has completely changed. They have their own virtual currency, and it very much underpins how they make their money at this point, and why and how people come to the site. You can purchase these tokens that are in the form of little hearts or lollipops. I mean, everything's virtual, so you're purchasing basically little bits of data. And it's all micropayment based, so the barrier to entry is really, really low. Whether you have a very low income or a higher income, you can participate on this platform. And there are opportunities to spend a lot of money, as well as the opportunities to spend quite a small amount. And so, it's grown quite considerably. And of course, YY gets a cut for every single transaction. And the people who actually are running all these chat rooms also get a cut. And you'll always have these fantastic stories of some people who are making hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm sure most people are actually making a fraction of that. It's like app stores, really. You always have the people who do very well, and so on. But the point is, they've created a business that basically just didn't exist before that. And it's a really interesting one, too, because it's a really nice ecosystem where YY benefits, but also the consumers benefit quite clearly as well. And they've been able to, again, because it's malleable, they haven't said, oh, well, sorry, it's only for karaoke now, that you can do whatever you want on it as long as it's within the realms of a community that's acceptable. So in 2014, they IPO'd. They've got about 50% of their revenue that now comes from this side of the business, and they are profitable. I don't know how profitable. I wasn't able to get those numbers, but it is all from basically following what the users were doing and trying to really think, is the current business on the right path, or do we just change it? And just changing it is a big thing, but sometimes it's what you have to do. So mindset number 2 is about diversity. And looking a little bit into the past again now, marketers used to use, well, probably, I'm not sure if they still do, I'm not sure what the measure currently is, but historically, people used a measure of about 50 million to mark the penetration of a product in society. And reaching that 50 million point, historically, it took a little while, right? Things just didn't move around the world as quickly, and populations weren't as big. And this period of time was often very useful for all sorts of reasons. Even looking at those charts that we had at the beginning, where you had the rapid technology change, you need the periods of stability in between. It builds mental models, it develops social norms, laws, all these things that kind of help a product actually really take hold in a society, and for people to actually welcome it and want it to be there, and understand how it's going to fit into our lives. And lately there's a lot of these products that right now are at that uncomfortable point where we just really don't know where they're going to go, how they're going to work, and what people will do with them. But the problem at the moment is that in a lot of cases, and certainly this is true for digital, not always as true for physical things, but even physical things, because the global marketplace is so big, they tend to move that much more quickly. So this period of time is now very much a luxury for a lot of products. And as a bit of an example, so it took 40 years for radio to reach that 50 million market penetration. And then it took 10 years for TV, and it took 5 years for the iPod, and then 6 months for YouTube, and Google Plus was a couple months. And whether you think some of these products are valuable or not, the thing is they still got to that number very quickly, and that's the challenge, right? So a lot of this lately is being propelled by mobile, the internet, and increasingly social. Social is really starting to be kind of the fuel for a lot of things. And so the audience is not just increasingly wide, and it doesn't come just increasingly quickly, but the audience is also increasingly diverse. So one of the things that's happening is that researchers are discovering that all the rapid technological change, one of the things it's doing is it's creating generation gaps that, well, that no longer really are generational. They're much more quick than they used to be. And this last piece of research was from Pew, a large research body in the United States, that all they do really is look at the impact of the internet on the world. They started off, I think, mostly looking at the US, but increasingly they're looking far more globally. And they're finding that people just 2 or 3 or 4 years apart, they're having really different relationships with technology. Now, I mean, that is technology, and that's one thing, and that definitely impacts a lot of products. Certainly when you have a product that's entirely digital, that can impact it quite a bit. But often also in a global marketplace, it's the cultural, the historical, the societal differences, how all of those intertwine that very much can make or break a product sometimes, independent of the technology changes and the perceptions of tech. So here's a couple examples. So China, as we know, is very big. There are 14 cities with a population over 5 million. So I think in Australia there's one that's kind of reaching that. I think Sydney is at that point. There's 41 cities with more than 2 million inhabitants. Again, in Australia there are 3. So it dwarfs absolutely anything we see anywhere else. And the middle class is growing at a fantastic pace, somewhere in the range of about 80,000 people a day. So that provides a whole bunch of challenges, specifically to do with retail. For a brand, if you want to reach all the rural residents, that's already hard enough, and in a lot of countries reaching rural residents can be tricky. But in China you have even more urban residents, and these cities are growing constantly. So just reaching the urban population, opening enough physical branches of anything to reach the urban population is ridiculously complicated and obviously quite costly. So it's not really surprising from that perspective that for a lot of Chinese people, shopping online is becoming not just an electronic version of what they do in other places, but it actually just becomes commerce pure and simple. It's just a pure mathematical thing of this is where the stuff is, and in the cities themselves, there's only so many places you can go. And because so many people are coming online on a mobile phone, it's the first device that they own, anything from a $50 inexpensive Android that's often locally made, and whether it's China or India or anywhere in the region, about $50 you can get a fairly decent phone now, all the way up. But again, as a result, it's not just the modern alternative to using a PC. It's often either the only or certainly the most frequent way that people use the internet and therefore engage with all these brands. So what this has done is caused a bunch of, all these things cause side effects, right? And so one of the things that's happened quite differently in China is whereas this is a North American number, but I think Australia and certainly Europe are very similar, most people, by and large, they will shop with individual retailers online. You'll go to the Target website or the H&M website and you will shop. In China, 90% of retail is through giant marketplaces, and these are places that basically aggregate all of these brands, and it's very different from what we're used to by and large. And the reason these sites have actually fit so well is that what they've really done is they've provided kind of it's an economically and socially and very much technologically appropriate alternative to all this missing infrastructure. You kind of backfilling the whole high street that we developed over the last 100 years onto the internet. And it gives you high visibility, high traffic, it's highly customizable. In the case of Alibaba has 2 sites, one called Tmall and one called Taobao, and they are the primary marketplaces in China. And certainly, especially on Tmall, which is for major brands, it costs money to get in, you have to be vetted, but then you have a space that you can kind of make your own. And and you can customize it quite a bit, but you get this huge audience, you get all the mobile optimization, all the social optimization built right in. And that's why even brands like Apple, they are on Tmall. It's the logical place to go, right? It's not the weird place to be. Even Amazon actually has a presence on Tmall now, which is a little bit funny. So the importance here, the reason I'm mentioning China to start is it's a really good example, but the point isn't so much about China itself, it's the characteristics that cause this situation. And if you find similar conditions elsewhere, then often the model can be replicated, or you can at very least take the learnings from there and transpose them somewhere else to a degree, right? So here's an example in Africa. Now, Africa, from a retail perspective, the situation is even more dire. I was watching a presentation from one of the heads of Jumia that is the large marketplace that's developing in Africa. It reaches about 10 markets at the moment, 10 countries within Africa. And again, it's a large marketplace where it aggregates all the products and all the brands. And they were saying that in Asia Pacific, there are about 7,000 consumers per retail outlet, which is already a big mismatch, right? Compared to North America, it's about 400 consumers per retail outlet. In Africa, there's 60,000 per retail outlet. So even more so than China, you just do it online. There's just almost no alternative right now if you want to get into that market, if you want to reach those consumers. Of course, you will build some brick and mortar, but you absolutely have to be online. And the one thing that's developing with a lot of these brands that move into these markets, and certainly the ones that embrace the environment, is it gives them a chance to experiment. It's the ultimate permission to experiment, because anything that's normal, back home, so to speak, is almost immaterial because it will just not work in that market. And then you can start to look for what's the most appropriate thing in that market that you can do. So what's happened with Jumia, for example, is that what they're saying is that when they enter a market, consumers come online on every channel they can think of almost immediately. There is no progression from digital, big screen to small screen to something else to telephone. It's just kind of everywhere. And so they have customer service agents that actually permanently live, so to speak, on Instagram and on WhatsApp in particular, and have interactions with customers. They have customers who will contact them on WhatsApp to initiate a sale. They will have the interaction there, and then they will complete the sale only entirely on WhatsApp. And they've never spoken physically, they've never actually gone to the website. And they've had to adapt to this. I mean, again, you can either embrace it or you lose those customers. And it's been a really substantial change. But it is very much the formalizing of what we saw at the very beginning with the example with Instagram and small ad hoc vendors, which goes to show also how pervasive some of this is becoming in certain markets. The other thing, there's some really interesting examples also on the delivery and fulfillment side, right? So one of the problems there's a bunch of problems. First of all, the delivery infrastructure doesn't necessarily exist. The roads are often poor. They can't just call UPS to go and deliver to people. So they've had to build a fleet of delivery people. Now, that aligns very nicely with yet another challenge, which is that a lot of their consumers don't have credit cards, so many of them pay at the door. So they've got these two things that have aligned, and then they have challenge number 3, which is that these are consumers who are new to retail. A lot of times they don't know what size to order. They're maybe not familiar with formal pick a size and understand your shoe size and things like that. So they'll order and it'll be wrong, and then they'll return it, and then they'll order again, and so on. So what they're basically saying to people now is order multiple sizes. We're going to deliver it to your door anyways. You have to pay us anyways. We'll wait. You try it on, and you pay for what it is that you actually want. And now, some of these examples sound really kind of a little bit crazy. And this particular example I first heard of actually 3 years ago. And it wasn't with Jumia at all. It was actually in Russia. And at the time, I thought, this will never work. They'll never keep doing this. It'll be one of those examples where I put up the slide and I say, hey, they did this. And then I'll have to take it down because it failed completely. But as it turns out, I now have 3 examples. I have Jumia, which is a very recent example. We have La Moda in Russia, I think they're still doing it. And in China, they're starting to call these mobile fitting rooms. And it's because the circumstances are all similar. In Russia, actually, there are credit cards, but no one wants to enter personal information online, so it's kind of a social barrier there. They also have poor postal infrastructure. And so there also, because the retail industry is a little bit more developed, there isn't really the problem about the frequent returns as much as it is more an opportunity to upsell. So actually there, they bring extra stuff spontaneously that might suit what the person bought, and they try to upsell them. So slight shifting of the context, but again, completely different way of looking at things. So the very last example, or mindset, is about resilience. And a lot of people talk about Apple as the poster child of the company that makes crazy amounts of profit and designs all these beautiful experiences. And Apple is very much focused on controlling absolutely everything, as we know. And it's all very multi-layered and interdependent. And if there's any chink in it, it all kind of starts to fall apart. And there are other companies that do this, that very much control and constrain, and the whole point is to kind of lead you on this journey. But increasingly, most products, they just won't have that luxury. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing at all, as we just discussed earlier. I think that actually kind of can free you up to do quite a few things. And so today, the most perfectly orchestrated products, they actually end up being the ones that are more brittle in a lot of cases, simply because they will be the first to fail for a bunch of different reasons. One is you make all these trade-offs, right? You make all these trade-offs in complexity. Often what you want to do is you want to make things very simple for the customer, but as a result, you create all this complexity internally to try to keep maintaining that. And then if anything starts to shift, right, I'm using Nespresso as an example because in some ways it is very simple for the consumer, but there's issues in terms of the price of aluminum, and recycling is becoming a huge problem for them in some countries, and there's the big backlash of should anyone be even buying any of these at all, right? And so your ability to react to change is really, really quite constrained, really. So what you could do, however, in some ways, if you have the ability to do so and you can step back, is design your product from the ground up to actually thrive in that amidst this disruption. So here is an example. So a final example is from the media industry, completely different. So in 2014, BuzzFeed, who's the big online viral media company, they closed a roll of funding, and they also announced that they were opening a new division, and they were calling it BuzzFeed Distributed. And the whole point of BuzzFeed Distributed was to address the growing problem that they had, which is that they had this confluence of mobile and social that in some ways was completely propelling their business, but it was also causing a lot of stress. It was kind of a blessing and a curse, is this confluence of mobile and social for them. And specifically, this is what was happening. So these are referrals to BuzzFeed.com from these 3 social sites. And so in other words, it's people who click out from Facebook and land on BuzzFeed. And normally that would be where you convert, right? Where you do the advertising and you make your money there. Right, so that was that size, and then this is the impressions in the social stream, people who actually never ever would make it to BuzzFeed. And so if your ability to make money was constrained in that little circle, then obviously you had a big problem. You had a lot of growth, a lot of conversation, a lot of customers, but in some ways they weren't really customers because you were trying to convert them and you just weren't, right? So the idea of BuzzFeed Distributed was that they would start to take the content out of the website and actually distribute it to the edges. They would actually put it on all of these sites. There were about 30 different global platforms around the world because they knew the audience was already there. They were already doing things there. They were engaging quite heavily, right? So they were going to put the content there. Now, the big problem still was then how do you monetize? And so as part of this, they built an analytical platform. They call it Pound, and it's got a big, long acronym. But the point of Pound is what they were trying to do was go beyond normal analytics that would still, the normal analytics would give them kind of a linear view inside of a platform, so they would know X number of people were on Facebook, but that was kind of all they had, right? And it would get increasingly hard to figure out also all the sub-behaviors of things like email or somebody sharing through SMS, and you just couldn't track that at all. So what Pound enables them to do, and apparently it's taken them a while to build it up, but they're starting to see results, is it captures the whole downstream, all the downstream visits from wherever it starts and how it propagates all the way down. And it's enabling them to understand so much better where their audience is, and they've also shifted their model so that what they basically do now is they distribute content to the edges, they get all this data back, and they use it to optimize the content, to better understand where to place it, and their financial models are now more dependent on where it's placed than actually pushing people back to BuzzFeed. And without this bespoke analytics platform, they wouldn't have been able, they would have had the one piece of, okay, they push the content out, but then what, right? So, and this was a recent quote from Jonah Peretti, the CEO, and he says, it increasingly doesn't matter where our content lives. And you can see that from a retail perspective also. A lot of people are starting to, the idea, again, that Target would say, well, it doesn't matter where you convert because it's all Target. We just have to find a way to redistribute the value to the employees. And so it's a huge advantage, basically, to be able able to do that. And it's things that obviously a lot of companies are still scared of, but he believes for him it makes them a stronger company, and it's certainly starting to look that way. So just a few parting thoughts, because I know I'm at the end here. The future is very rarely short on narratives, and I specifically want to call out one point, which is about data, especially since the last example was very data-focused. And there's a lot of conversation about big data and how you can optimize and how you can track and you can do all these things. And definitely, there will be many, many opportunities in the future to measure what your customers are doing, how they're doing it. This will start to conflate with tracking and whether people will be happy for that to occur or not. And there's definitely a lot of discussion about anticipation, entire anticipation engines trying to conflate the user's context with what they might want, so you can then recommend, so you can then track and optimize and do it again and again. And obviously, data has a big part to play in all of this, but to kind of loop it back to design is often there's a little bit of a worry sometimes that it feels as if maybe design is the thing we're talking about today, but in the future, no worries, we'll just do it all with data. So I'm going to leave you with one last quote, which is actually from one of the data scientists at BuzzFeed, which is that you have to have a lot of intuition and a lot of creativity, and the data is just one part of the input. And the data will tell you, and that's if you're very lucky, it'll tell you what happened, but it won't ever tell you why. And if you want to understand why, that requires a very different set of skills, and largely in your brain and also in your heart. And that's it. Thank you very much.